So one of the things that we look at with blended learning is how am I not just having a single learning event? Because again, one of the things we know from the educational psychology is that if people hear something only once, that's just not very sticky in terms of either changing behavior. A single learning event can make a big difference for somebody, but that's more unusual than it is usual. And so then we start to look at questions like how do we want to reinforce things? How do we want to refresh people's knowledge? How do we want to provide support when they're actually in the workflow? All of those kinds of questions. So I wanted to take a look at some of the categories or the ways that I think about it. Now, this is a really simple tool that I use when I'm thinking through an overarching curriculum. And it's got 7 categories in here: preparation, what should the learner do to prepare for the learning experience? For example, in this course, we asked you to identify some learning objectives from one of your own projects to bring it into this class. So that was the main thing that we did for preparation for this one. Then learning, what kinds of learning experiences should the learner have? This could be classroom activities, this could be e-learning, this could be self-study kinds of stuff. Then, and I'll dig more into each one of these, practicing coaching, especially for skills, procedures or skills, we want to think about that. Really coaching and feedback. What kind of job aids, just-in-time support, performance support do we have? How do we refresh things? And if it's a more complex skill, how are they going to develop further once they've mastered the basics? So let's take a look at each one of these. For preparation, it could be a number of different things. It could be maybe a pre-assessment to see what level learners are coming in at. It could be a pre-learning activity, watch a video or read an article. It could be just priming people, like getting them to think about a particular topic or a particular area. Like I said, our preparation activity for this course was for you to think about a learning challenge that you wanted to analyze and to identify some learning objectives for it. It could be a promotional campaign where we're sort of advertising or getting people hopefully a little bit excited about the topic. So it's basically anything around what should the learner do to prepare for the learning experience. For the learning activities, we're really going to focus in on that next week. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's really this question of what kind of learning experiences should the learner have to support the objectives. For practice, like I said, particularly, practice is useful for a lot of things, but in particular, we want to think about skills. How are they going to practice the skill? That's the really big one. It's useful for procedures. It's useful for other kinds of things. Practice can be a way to handle motivation issues. If you can get people to be more comfortable with a behavior by practicing it, then maybe they're going to be more likely to do it. There can be a lot of application for that. And you want to think about what are they doing during the learning experience? What are they doing after the learning? And sometimes a big part of practice is getting more of a visceral experience with things. So instead of it being abstract, how do we make it more concrete for people? How do we make it feel real? So for example, if we think about our connecting families learning objective from the NICU course, how do we help families connect together? The practice for that may be like looking at a bunch of different scenarios and thinking about how would I connect people in this scenario or how would I connect people in this scenario, but taking something where it's like maybe bullet points that just say, hey, it's really good to connect families so that they can learn from each other, and try to take it into something that feels like a real concrete example. And so that's what we mean when we talk about the visceral experience piece. How do I make this concrete? How do I make this feel real for people? For feedback, coaching, and mentoring, I think you're already very aware of this. This is things like the assisted supervision. The question is, if people are doing the right thing, how are they finding out they're doing the right thing? And if they go back and they're not doing it right, how are they finding out what they should be doing instead? And so really it comes down to how are they getting feedback on their performance? Sometimes we don't have somebody who can actually coach or give them feedback. And then we want to look at things like, is there at least some self-assessment criteria that we can give them? Or is this something where maybe they can do some peer assessment where they evaluate each other and at least there's some kind of feedback mechanism in there? Peer assessment is actually nice because it's a learning experience on both sides. So it can help somebody get some feedback on their work, but it can also help the person who's giving feedback really internalize the criteria. And so I think peer assessment is actually a really nice tool that could get used more often. When we think about resources or just-in-time support, again, this is something you're probably really familiar with. It's maybe just-in-time learning. It could be a series of videos that they can access via mobile device. It could be a job aid. It could be reference material. It could be something that we're building into the process. It could be a sign on the wall or a checklist that they work with. But it's just any of the different pieces of support materials that a learner needs when they're doing it. Refreshing is a couple of the things you want to think about when you're especially with knowledge-based objectives, is how frequently are they going to use this? Because one of the things we know with knowledge-based things is that people may learn it up front, and we hope they learn it up front, but then they start to forget things if they're not using it frequently. So for example, if it's something they learn and then they use every day, you probably don't need to refresh it. It's probably fine. But if it's something that they learn and then maybe don't use for 6 months, you want to ask the question of, how am I going to refresh that knowledge? For example, if it's, I was just doing a course with a client on cybersecurity, and they do a thing on how to do good passwords. And they find that people coming out of the class do use the method for creating good safe computer passwords right after they take the class. But a few months later, it starts to get a little bit vague, and people are more likely to reuse old passwords, and people are likely to be less safe. And so they decided that they would refresh that information every quarter, just so that we're reminding people and keeping it top of mind. 2+2 refers to a method from someone named Art Cohn, who's a cognitive psychologist. And what he does is 2 days after a course, he'll ask people some questions about the content of the course. And then 2 weeks after the course, he'll send them some scenario application questions for the course. And then 2 months after the course, he'll follow up and check in with people about how they're using it or what they remember or how they're applying it. And so it's this idea of 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, and that helps. The more we check in about something or the more frequently we refresh it, the more likely it is that people are to remember something. And then the developing further, you will have topics that are pretty straightforward and just don't need to be developed further. Once they've learned it, it's fine. And then you will have much more complex topics that are, all we're going to be able to do is get people through the beginning part of things in the first go round. And so you need to have a plan for, okay, we get people through the basic material as part of this learning activity, but how are we going to come back and leverage some kind of further learning opportunity for people? How do we take people, once they've mastered the beginning, to intermediate or to a mastery kind of thing? And you don't necessarily have to have all the answers to this, but if it is a complex skill, there's likely to need to be some kind of conversation or some kind of thought put towards how do we develop further. Oh, Bina had a question about what is just-in-time learning. So the idea behind just-in-time learning is, instead of I'm going to teach you this thing and maybe you'll use it in 3 months, instead I'm going to create a video, and when this comes up, the idea is that you're going to go look at the video. So I'm not really expecting you to know, we're not really expecting you to remember this forever. We're more expecting you to go use the information just exactly when you need it. Some things work well for just-in-time learning. For example, tech support kinds of things are good just in time. Like, I don't need to learn 6 months before my printer breaks how to fix my printer. But when my printer is actually broken, I want to go look up a video on how to fix my printer. Other things don't work quite so well. So you don't want people watching the video on how to evacuate the building when the building's actually on fire. So that's not a good just-in-time learning scenario. All right, so these are the different categories that we think about it. And it's one of these things where we have all of these different kinds of things that we can do. So examples might be pre-work awareness campaign or a case study for preparation. It might be for practicing, it might be role plays or hands-on practice or paired practice activities. It might have to do with checklist evaluations, self or peer evaluation, Job aids might be job aid resources, might be micro learning or performance support or checklists or things. Refreshing might be an actual refresher training. It might be an email that goes out a few months after the course. It might be reinforcement in team meetings by managers or supervisors or coaches. Developing further might be additional learning opportunities, or it might be connecting people to learning communities so that they can continue to have conversations about this. So one of the things is that certain types of learning gaps lean into some specific categories. So for example, knowledge, all of these can apply to knowledge. I don't want to suggest that like you never are going to do feedback, coaching, mentoring about knowledge topics. Of course you will. I just took my dog to the vet clinic. She had something with her eye, she's fine. But I took my dog to the vet clinic at the university here in where I live. And the doctor who was the vet who was looking at my dog was clearly refreshing the knowledge of the student. She was asking her questions about what are we going to do with this? And what does this maybe mean? And what could this suggest? And so she was clearly doing coaching, mentoring, but it was around knowledge refreshing. So the topic can always be included in any of these, but in particular, learning is likely to be, or knowledge is likely to be a learning activity. You're almost certainly going to want to look at job aids or resources and see if those are necessary. And you're going to want to look at refreshing if it's an infrequently used thing. So those are not, and I'm not saying you will ever use all of these for everything. That's not the point, but these are some specific things you think about. Procedures almost always have a learning component. They might have a practice or a visual experience component. And a lot of times we might look at job aid and resources. Skills are very much about all of these going through learning, practicing, feedback, coaching, mentoring. It can also require job aids. It can also require refreshing or developing further. It just depends. Habits, a lot of times, are about practice that becomes automatic, or it might be about some kind of feedback mechanism, or it might be about some support tool that keeps people thinking about the habit. It might be about refreshing it periodically. Motivation can crop up here. Environment is sometimes about, can I evaluate my environment or decide if I'm doing it right? So all of these can apply, but there's certain ones that apply a little bit more than others to some of these topics. The other thing, and we're almost done with this, it's not usually a straight line. It's not usually we do this and then 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 we do this. It can be, that can be a good way to design the learning experience, but maybe it's something like this. If it's procedural, they learn it and we give them a job aid and that's all we need, right? Sometimes it's like this, where we learn it and then we practice a whole bunch and then we do some feedback and mentoring and then we use the job aid, but then we realize we need a little bit more feedback and mentoring. Then we're going to refresh it a few times, but we're also going to add to the job aids and then we're going to develop further. So this isn't a perfect linear process, but these are just more all of the categories that you might want to think about and ask yourself, will this help? Will this help support this learning objective? Will this help support this curriculum? That was a lot. Any questions about this? We're going to take a look at a few examples.